Hello and welcome to Deeper, a vodcast series where we have honest conversations with interesting people who have led unique lives. This is a companion vodcast series to our video series, Deep. And if you enjoy these videos, please do hit the subscribe button below and send these unique stories to even more people. My name is Danny Lorimer, and I am joined here today by Harry, who is a former spy for MI6 and an author. Harry, before we go into everything in your incredibly interesting career, can you give the audience just a little top line of what they expect in this podcast about yourself?
Yeah, sure, Danny. Well, I was an MI6 officer, picked up at Oxford University and worked there for several years. And I've also worked for the National Investigation Service, which you've probably never heard of. Most people haven't, but was a secret undercover unit that fought arms smugglers, drug smugglers, and so forth. And then I became an author writing about things and was picked to be the presenter of the BBC TV series Spy, which was supposed to train 10 ordinary people to be real spies. I've probably become the world's best-known ex-MI6 officer. I think at the last count, the BBC had sold that series to over 100 countries.
Oh, wow.
So you can imagine my cover's pretty thoroughly blown.
Goodness me, a man of many hats.
And little money.
Well, look, there's so much to get into there. I think it's important, I think, to kind of establish for the audience who don't know at home.
Sure.
What is MI6? I think that's probably the keyest thing to go, because I think lots of people wouldn't know the difference between MI6 and MI5, particularly internationally.
And I wouldn't blame them because neither did I when I joined. I joined in a very unusual way, in that I was in my last year at Oxford, and that was the way you were picked up in those days for MI5 and MI6. And a tutor just said to me one sunny afternoon when he got bored listening to me reading my essays, "What are you doing when you go down from Oxford, Harry?" And I said, being typical 20-year-old, I was like, "Oh, I don't know." And he said, "Have you ever thought of working for your country in certain ways?" He had a terrible twitch. Again, I didn't really know what he meant. And I said, "Yeah, sure." And the next thing I know, I got a brown envelope in the pigeonhole at the college, inviting me up to an interview, which turned out to be an interview with MI6. And the basic difference between MI5 and MI6 is that MI5, by and large, deals with intelligence and security matters within the United Kingdom. So they're like the secret police. Whereas MI6 is responsible for gathering intelligence all over the rest of the world. So we're the people who run agents in Iran and Russia and China and all the really sort of tasty places. And that's the service which is supposedly represented in the James Bond films.
And then, let's go right back to the start then. I think we like to kind of tell these stories chronologically, what your life's like. And where did you grow up? What were you like as a kid? What was life like?
I grew up in the countryside in Berkshire, amongst a lot of farms. So I was brought up on farms, very much a country lad. I don't think I had a very unusual background. I wasn't particularly academically gifted. I know I said that I was at Oxford, but I think I got in more by luck than anything else. I remember I had the interview there, and it wasn't going terribly well. But the three tutors who did the interview had obviously had a very liquid lunch. You can imagine what it was like. And I made one joke and they couldn't stop laughing, and I was in. So I don't think I got in on my academic skills so much as my ability to tell a joke.
That was not what I was expecting you to say.
No, exactly.
But then obviously you were saying you were recruited in Oxford, which is, I think, quite the stereotypical story of how
certainly was
spies are
then,
recruited. Yeah. So how did that, what did your tutor see in you as an individual that made him think, oh, this person could work for the security services?
I honestly don't know. He never took much of an interest in me before, and I don't think I was particularly good at studying his subject. But I think he did detect that I'd got a mind for small detail. If there was a particular subject that came up, I could remember the small, useless bits of information. But I wasn't so good at analysing the large stuff. And I think that may have made him think, here's a guy who we can send out on the ground and will remember the faces of surveillance teams. And, if he has to remember particular details of a mission, we'll probably remember it. And also in those days, quite a few people used to get asked. I said yes. Quite a lot of people said no. It was just accepted in those days that it was one of the things you might get asked to do. In fact, there were even one or two tutors who were known to be talent spotters. It's absolutely different now. Now they have proper interviews at interview fairs. You can get recruited on the internet. There are job adverts in newspapers and so forth. So totally different from my day.
And so what did you study? So interested at Oxford?
I'm not allowed to say.
You're not allowed to say?
No, it's when I started doing the spy TV series for the BBC, we had to sit down and decide what I was and wasn't allowed to say. And so I'm not allowed to say which college it was, which subject it was. I'm not allowed to tell you which languages I speak, because, of course, if you know which languages I speak, then you've got a pretty good idea where I served, and somebody from another country watching this who knew where I served would then might be able to say, hang on, let's look at these years and these countries and so forth. So I've got some very clear red lines about what I am and am not allowed to say, and unfortunately, that's one of them.
Are you able to talk then about what the process was like from that moment where your tutor put you forward for this to the point where you're actually, what's the recruitment, what's the training process like to become a spy?
Yeah, it's interesting because the way the British do it is quite different to, say, the way the Americans do it. So as with everything, Britain is short of money. So when it comes to training spies, you don't want to get to training a lot of spies and then have to get rid of them. So in the UK, there's a long interview process, and then very few people get selected. But if you get through onto the training course, then there's a good chance you will finish. Because the idea is, it was part of the sort of ethos of the whole thing. Because you want all your spies to be as different as possible, they shouldn't all come out of the same mold. The idea is you take people with different ranges of skills and then you make them spies. They don't all fit the same mold. Whereas I was talking to Mike Baker of the CIA about this, and he, like me, is a trainer. And a totally different perspective. They get rid of about 50% of the people on their courses. And it's much more quasi-military. And you can always, if you meet a CIA officer, they do tend to be quite similar. I don't know whether it's the haircuts, but you get this feeling, that you're talking to a CIA officer. Whereas the whole idea with the British services is that you've got to be much more clever, that nobody should be able to go into a room and say, that's the British spy. In fact, quite a lot of the fun comes in making people think they know who the British spy is. But no, the idea is they should be as diverse as possible. And so the training is very supportive. It's, you would imagine if you watch the James Bond films, for instance, that the training is, all about handling guns and explosives and karate and things like that. It's much more supportive than that. They're not looking to fail you. They're looking to take your strengths and improve them. Now, obviously, I can't sort of go into the detail of the training courses, but there's this difference in the feeling between British training and the training in, say, some other countries.
But then just to go back there to the interview bit where you said, obviously, if I go to a job interview, I'm being asked, what do you want? Where do you want to be in 5 years' time, or things like that? Or what do they ask you to determine whether or not you're appropriate to be in such an important organization?
I don't think the questions they ask are terribly important, actually, because, again, this comes down to the difference between what people think spies are and what spies actually do. So people imagine that spying is a very dangerous occupation. It's not. In the 115 years of the existence of MI6, the number of MI6 officers that have been killed in operations is 0.
Right.
That's not the James Bond image.
Yeah.
And this is not because MI6 officers are particularly more skilled than others. It's because the way that all intelligence services work is, let's say that tomorrow you were told, Danny, there's this Iranian nuclear plant. We think they're producing a nuclear bomb for Iran. We need to get find out what they're doing. Doesn't matter how good your Farsi is or how good your disguises are, you're not going to walk in there. Yeah. But what you might be able to do is find an Iranian scientist who needs something, needs some help, has some aspect to his character which you can exploit, and they will tell you what's going on in there. So what spies do is they run agents. All people who are members of things like MI6, CIA, FSB, etc., we're officers. Our job is to run agents. We recruit them, we train them, we run them. The agent runs the risk. So when the job goes belly up, I'm on the first plane back to London, but the agent gets left behind to the job. So what you're looking for in the interview process is you're not looking for a particular kind of person, but I think, having sort of done this, you sit there and you say, this person, if I sent them abroad to do this job, is another person going to trust this officer with their life? Because that's what you're essentially asking them to do. And often not just their life, but their families' lives. And it's really hard to nail down what that quality is, but you know it when you see it. We found this on the BBC series Spy. We had these 10 people who'd been selected from over 5,000 people who'd applied to take part in the series. And, of course, we were interested to know, of the 10 that we picked, who all had their own particular strengths, who would win. And the person who won was this secretary from Scotland called Nicola, who you would never in a million years think could be a spy. She didn't seem to have much about her. but was so good out on the ground, so good at dealing with people, getting people to trust her, and just her awareness of things. I remember we took her on a surveillance course, and against some ex-SAS troopers. They did the surveillance, and she did the counter-surveillance. And I remember they came to us afterwards and said, "Who is she? She ring her because she's so good." And we said, "No, she's only had a couple of hours training for the TV show."
So a lot of it's trust building then. A lot of it's
Absolutely, yeah.
that
Yeah, you've got to believe, if let's say you're the scientist, that if you go in there, that no matter what happens, I will save you, that you can trust your life to me. Now, that's a huge thing to ask. And the actual process of recruitment is we could spend an hour talking about that in itself. It's known in one service as the dance of the seven veils, because there are different stages you have to get the person through until they're considered to be fully recruited. But you've absolutely got to believe that, I'm not your puppet master. I am your best mate, and I will come and get you. And what you are doing for me is dead important. And together we are going to do something that really matters. That's the way the message is put. It's not that I come along and say, "Oh, I noticed you've been spending some time with a woman other than your wife. Now work for me, or else." Because you can imagine, you would not get good intelligence that way. This person would not try their best. But if you believe that the regime is wrong, or if you want to get your family out, or if there's something else that we share, and I say, "Look, we can work together on this," that's a totally different basis. And that's why spies are completely different from the way that people often think spies are from watching Bourne and Bond and all the others.
So, because actually it's really more appealing to a higher reason to do something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rather than going in and just going...
Absolutely.
Seducing the secret out of them.
See, the interesting thing about it is that I said that no officer has been killed in operations in the whole history of MI6. And so people get the impression, you find this on training courses, early on the training course, people are like, "Oh, that's great then, it's not going to be dangerous." But in fact, the agents you run are closer than some of your best friends, because you not only see them when you're with them, but they are obviously put under surveillance at other times, their premises, maybe. You know so much about them. There have been psychological studies of them, and so you know everything about them. You know about their family, about their kids, etc., etc. So when I said that if an operation goes wrong, you leave the country, they get left holding the blame. That guilt,
Huge.
If you are responsible, particularly, there's a famous moment on the BBC Spies series where they were just too flippant. So I tried to make them understand. I said, if you get picked up as an agent in Zimbabwe, for instance, at the time that was under a particularly murderous regime then, I said, they will come, they will pick you up, they will take you away, and not just you, they'll take away your wife and your kids, and they will come with the chainsaws, and they will chop them to little pieces in front. I was trying to get them to understand what the cost is. Now, you imagine that you are an officer for the American or the British services. You've lost an agent under those circumstances. It's the guilt for what you're responsible for that has ended more careers that I've known than anybody, any bullet or knife in a back alley or anything like that. And again, it's that mental cost that people don't see on officers who've been in the job for a long time.
And I suppose you formed a really deep relationship with these agents anyway. Like, you always spend a lot of time speaking to them over weeks and months and maybe even years.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so let's just go back a little bit before we've gone into quite a bit of detail there about how spies operate, I suppose. But when you were first then recruited and you got through and you were selected, is there like a junior level you start at? Do you start as a junior spy and then work your way up? Or do they throw you straight into the deep end?
Well, again, I can't really talk about specifics, but it comes back to this rule of you want to keep your enemy guessing. So there are no hard and fast rules. So you might start as a junior spy. You might get thrown in at the deep end. It partly depends on who you are and what your qualities are, and also what an operation requires. Now, it's so much easier to check on somebody's record and what they've been doing. In my day, you could just go down to an office, pick up your alias passport, your secretary would book a ticket for you, and you would fly out to Mozambique and you would do the job, right? And you could say, "My name is Mr. Smith and I'm a psychiatrist or a tightrope walker," or whatever it is. Now, if you turn up in a foreign country under alias, they will check your Facebook page, they will check your social media contacts, they will want to know what you've been doing. So you can prepare in-depth legends, as we say, but it's a lot easier if, for instance, rather than have somebody who says that they're a brain surgeon who isn't, why not recruit somebody who's been a brain surgeon or a doctor of some kind and has got a proven record as a doctor? why shouldn't they be recruited in their 30s or 40s as a spy?
Makes it easier to
Perfect cover.
pretend, doesn't it?
Exactly. So it's completely changed from the way it was 40 years ago. Not everybody starts as a junior spy. People are joining from different backgrounds, ethnic and religious backgrounds, different ages.
This is going to seem like maybe a silly question, but the thing I would struggle with the most, if I was a spy, would be remembering I have a different name or a different, like, is there a different moment where you're like, you can slip up and go, oh, hi. I would just naturally go, oh, hi, I'm Danny.
Yeah.
To anyone. Like, how did you remember to keep what your story was and keep on track of what the spy story was?
I've got a very good friend who's an actor.
Yeah.
And when we talk about the work that he does and stuff, it's very similar in that you train for it. So, if we trained you, you would be able to do it. And it's just like being an actor, you inhabit that role. And indeed, something else you look for during the recruitment process is people who are able, and again, this is so hard to draw out, and we keep trying different things to draw it out, but somebody who can believe that they are what they are pretending to be.
Right.
It sounds like a kind of odd phrase. Perhaps one of the ways I can illustrate it is polygraph machines, which some people mistakenly call lie detectors. Mm-hmm. They found that there's a class of people who can do very well against polygraphs. They're basically what we call Walter Mitty types, after a film called The Life and Death of Walter Mitty, about a guy who just kept pretending to be famous people. There are some people who have an ability to just say, oh, I'm Arthur the Milkman, and believe that they're Arthur the Milkman. Now, partly that's natural talent, like you might find natural talent with a sportsman. Partly that's training. But if you train for that, you can do it. And it's surprising. It's like taking on a coat. I used to think when I used to pick up my alias documentation, I used to imagine myself like putting on a jacket or something, that now I am this person with all these papers. And your brain does a little switch. So to some extent, it's a natural ability, but also it's just down to good training.
It's amazing. It does sound like acting. I suppose like a product, an actual item can bring you into the character. That's so interesting. And then, so obviously, you kind of talked through what you talked through before about it's a lot of it's recruiting people on the ground and what you call the dance of the seven veils.
Dance of the seven veils, yeah. Somebody else called it stripping away the layers of the onion, which I just think just sounds less romantic, doesn't it? Dance of the seven veils sounds much more exciting.
And what year are we talking here? Or what rough time are we talking?
When I was recruited?
I
was recruited in the early 1980s. So the Cold War was at its height. The Soviet Union was the big baddie. It was all about nipping behind the Berlin Wall.
Yes.
And that classic Le Carré spying was what I started in. And it's been fascinating that I started off in a world with all those classic spy tricks like dead letterboxes and brush contacts.
Explain those two things.
Okay, well, a dead letterbox is in America it's called a dead drop, but the British call it a dead letterbox. And this is when you choose a location where you can leave a message. And the idea will be that the agent who's doing all the hard work and running the risks will come along at a later time and pick up the message. So, for instance, it could be a rock at the base of a particular tree that's coloured slightly different to the other rocks. Something that you can just, as you're walking around, just drop out of your pocket onto the ground. Because even if surveillance is behind you, as long as you choose your route carefully, they won't see you, just take the thing out and drop it, right? And in this hollow rock will be the message containing the instructions to the agent. 3 days later, your agent comes along, he's looking for that coloured rock, and he finds it, picks it up, takes it home, or opens it there and gets a message. That's a dead letterbox. A brush contact is that thing you may have seen in lots and lots of spy films where one person approaches another, they've both got identical briefcases or carrier bags or whatever it is, and one puts one down and then picks the other guy's up and walks on. So they've effectively swapped briefcases. And those were real techniques and were really used. And it all changed when microelectronics came in and the computer revolution happened. And so, for instance, take the brush contact. Instead of doing a brush contact and me swapping a briefcase with somebody in the street and walking off and the briefcase has got their secret intelligence report in it, they brought in these little boxes on which you would type your message for the agent. And the agent had a similar little box about the size of a cigarette packet. And you could actually be on the other side of a square, never mind a street. And as you both agree to be there at a certain time, as you're walking through the square, you press a button on this box in your pocket. It Burst transmits your secret instructions to your agent. His little box warbles in his pocket and he knows that he's picked up instructions. He can go home, look at the box there. And it began to get even more complicated than that because they decided to start using base stations because they thought rather than having both the officer and the agent in the same place at the same time, we need a delay, just as used to happen with the old dead letterboxes. So they introduced it so that you would have a base station, for instance, hidden in a rock in a park, something that nobody's going to pick up and run home with. You would go along, press your little button, your instructions to your agent would be transmitted to the base station hidden in the rock. You would then go home, taking your surveillance team with you. Up to a couple of weeks later, the agent can come along, not even go to the rock, just walk past the area, just press the button in his little box in his pocket, and the message would be transmitted from the rock to him. So it began to get that complicated. And there was a famous case in about 2006 when the MI6 station in Moscow was using one of these base stations. And unfortunately, the Russians turned one of the agents. He explained how he was being contacted. And they worked out from his device and various other technical tricks where the base station was. They then put the base station, which was in this rock in this Russian park, under surveillance. Now, standing instructions are, if there's a problem, you just abandon everything, right? Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, standing instructions don't always get obeyed. And the Russians filmed, I think it was 3 different MI6 officers coming up and kicking the rock and trying to see why it wasn't working. And subsequently, the Russians expelled, I think, the entire Moscow MI6 station because they once you've got one officer, you can make links to others and so on and so forth. So it wasn't quite the perfect method that everybody thought it was. You know, the old methods sound clumsy, and all these microelectronic ways sound very exciting, don't they? And very secure. No, and it's since been learnt that quite often things like burst transmissions, for instance, can be intercepted.
Right.
So they're now. So oddly enough, I'm now so old that I saw it all start with sort of the old Le Carré Moscow rules since. I've seen it go through the golden electronic age, and we're now, in many cases, coming back to the old ways of doing things with paper and so forth because you can trust it.
Can't hack paper.
There was a story in the paper this morning that in America, a top secret database has been hacked, and they're really worried, according to the stories that were in the newspapers this morning, that the Chinese have got some sort of quantum computing capability. Everybody's been right on the edge of it. Google and so forth have been quite close, and the Chinese are trying as well. And the reason everybody wants that is because no matter how good your computer encryption is, if you've got quantum decryption, then it opens up all that information. And so you can imagine if, for the sake of argument, somewhere that in MI6 headquarters in Vauxhall Cross, there's a computer which has the identity of all your agents on, you must be very worried.
Yeah.
That sooner or later, it will be hacked in some way. So as you can imagine, paper, where you know what's written down, so in many ways is much more trustworthy. In the early days, there used to be what were known, and John le Carré has written about this because he was in MI6 as well as MI5. There were what known as registry queens, because when I started off, there were no computers. It was all on paper files. And you had to, if you wanted to find out about an agent or a personality, you had to request the files. The people in charge of whether or not you got those files were these little old ladies who each ran a different department. And ye gods and little fishes, they were better than any computer encryption system. Because if you asked for a file and you probably didn't have it, they flipping knew. And in some ways, I think our security would be better if we could go back to using these registry queens rather than computer encryption.
It's amazing it's going full circle.
Yeah, absolutely.
But back to paper.
Well, everything goes full circle. It's not only the techniques that go full circle, it's the people you work with. So when I started off, we were supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan because they were fighting the Russians who had invaded Afghanistan. We were fighting the IRA because of terrorism. Move on 20 years, we're fighting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan because they're now attacking us. And a lot of the weapons that we supplied to them, we're now trying to buy back. And at the same time, we're now in government with Sinn Féin, which was the political wing of the IRA. So you can see how everything, not just the techniques, but who your enemy is. I mean, the Russians have gone from being deadly enemies in the Cold War to the 1990s. We actually had formal liaison with them.
Yeah.
And the idea was that we were partnering them against certain global threats. Now under Putin, they're deadly enemies. So everything goes around the same.
I was going to ask about that because it was like if you're in an organization like this and a big world event happens, like, things change. How fast does that then kind of go around the organization going, these guys are now our friends? Do you know what I mean? Like, so the Berlin Wall collapses and USSR is changing or collapsing around us, or like these big world events. How does that impact the work of these spies here on the ground?
Oh, tremendously. As I said, I joined in the early 1980s, which was kind of like a golden age of spying because the Soviet threat was so big.
Yeah.
Berlin Wall comes down. What's everybody going to do? And it's famously been recorded that at MI6, there was what was known as the Night of the Long Knives in 1992, when they got rid of a lot of senior spies because there was no need. I mean, if you haven't got Russia as an enemy, who's your enemy? Muslim terrorism hadn't taken off then. So this is why I ended up working for the NIS. I remember I was expecting to get posted to Poland, and I got called in and told, yeah, we're sending you to Customs and Excise. And I thought, what the heck's going on? Because I had visions of standing in one of those shirts with the epaulets at Heathrow Airport, going through people's suitcases. And at the time, SIX was trying to get into the fight against organised crime, because it was figured that with the Russians out of the picture, you had to do something. And so drugs and terrorism were the way forward. Everything changed after 9/11. That changed the whole picture again. Then you've got a whole new enemy. And then, of course, not long after that, Putin takes charge, and we're almost back to the Cold War. But for a long time, budgets were cut. Why do you need to pay your spies a lot of money if you haven't got that much to spy on? And I know that this was true of things like the military as well. They also suffered budget cuts. So world events do have a tremendous effect on what these organizations do, not least because if there's a terrorist attack or some incident in one country tomorrow, the government wants to know who did it, why, what's the background, will there be another attack? So part of the art of intelligence isn't just spying on the enemies you know, but working out who are going to be your enemies tomorrow, or where the attacks are going to come tomorrow, and being ready to have your agency, because it can take years to recruit an agent.
Yeah.
So you've got to look ahead and think, where are the useful people going to be if the following scenarios happen?
Must give you such a strange worldview, constantly looking forward ahead of where things could be going.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Things. And like when you were talking there about the what's it called, the brush contact?
Yes.
When you were talking about brush contact and things like that. Obviously we all grew up watching James Bond. We all grew up watching spy films and all these kind of things, and seen these things in movies.
Yeah.
First time you do something like that, are you not thinking, this is so cool? Like a little bit of you going,
no, that's not your first thought. Your first thought is, I hope I get away with it.
Yeah.
Is anybody watching me? Yeah, it's nerve-wracking the first few times. In fact, I think it's always nerve-wracking, because anytime you use that in anger, people's lives are on the line. If I muck this up, if I haven't done this right, the key thing with the brush contact is anybody following me? Mm-hmm. The brush contact takes a split second, and as long as you've picked your location carefully, there's almost no chance of it being overseen. But is a surveillance team following you in? And this is why we spend a lot of time in all intelligence services training in counter surveillance, the art of knowing whether you are being watched. And oddly enough, you would think that knowing you're being watched is a terrible time for a spy. If you actually spot the surveillance team and think, "Oh, right, they're on me today," you'd think, "Oh, yeah, now I'm in trouble." No, it's the best time in the world to be a spy is when you've got a surveillance team behind you and you've spotted them, because now you can do nothing. You can take them. I've obviously worked both sides of the fence because I work for the NIS, so I've been on surveillance, and it's very labor intensive. It's not you follow people down the road. You basically contain them in this box of people and vehicles, and you control their movements like that, with people crisscrossing the box and getting sight. It just requires so much coordination, so much effort. You're always running or driving at high speed, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I have to say, as the spy in the middle of that, you think, great, what shall I do? I'll take them to this crowded shopping centre, because that's going to make them work really hard. I'm going to go out into the country, because I know that means they can't be close to me, and they're going to have to take even wider distances. So again, the reality of spying is often different from the way you'd expect. A lot of the things that people think that spies would think are bad are actually quite good for us, and we enjoy much more.
So that's interesting how they kind of track someone who's in this, like, how do they, what do you call counter surveillance on someone? How do you notice when someone is watching you? What is it that what are the signs that someone's there?
It's the same thing twice. Gosh, again, it's like an entire lecture series, but what underlines it is seeing the same thing twice, the same pair of shoes, the same. I remember I worked with a guy in the FBI who said shoes, belts, and I can't think it was ties was the other thing. He said, when I'm out doing it, shoes, belts, and ties. Once I've got that, I've got the man. And if I see one of those again, I just switch off and I do nothing. So it's you try and create situations where you get You see things that they don't expect you to see. The classic example would be, although it's not used very much, would be the reflection in a mirror. Sorry, not a mirror, a shop window, for instance. So they think you're not looking behind you, but you can see behind you, and you realize that there's a guy behind you who you saw 3 streets ago, and it doesn't make sense they should be there. Or you change your location. So there's no logical reason for a face you saw here to be a face you saw there. And once you've got one, you've probably got more, and you don't have to see the whole team, and you don't have to be right. I mean, if you think you're being followed and the evidence is pretty good, call it off. It doesn't matter if you're wrong. There's all these meetings and brush contacts and other arrangements have backups, and you go to your backup. So it's only when you're absolutely convinced you're clean that you go ahead with those meetings. So there are lots of little tricks, a lot of which I can't talk about, because obviously if I tell you what the tricks are by which we spot surveillance, then it helps our enemies. All I will say is, the whole thing has got so much more complicated, because when I started off, surveillance was a thing done on foot by people who, I remember personal radio, because they all have to be in radio contact. You can do it with hand signals. I've trained to do it with hands. It's a nightmare. It's like watching tic-tac men at the race course. They all contact by radios. It used to be really hard to get that coordination there. Now we have drones, you have CCTV cameras everywhere, you have facial recognition technology with those CCTV cameras, so it's so much easier to track individuals as they move around. And you, as the spy, now have to cope not just with human surveillance, but technical surveillance, drones, all the other things. So it's become a much more complex game. But it's still, I have to say, of all the things that a spy does, that's still the thing that I enjoy best, because although a lot of spying is a team game, that's the one time when you're the only person that matters. You're the target. You make the decisions. You decide what traps to lay. You decide what route to take, etc. And I really like that sense of you up against all these other assets. And that's how the surveillance game has changed.
To explain that, shoes, belts, and tie. Basically, are you looking for repetition? Then it's going, oh, that's the same guy I saw earlier.
Yes. So people in surveillance are trained in every surveillance team to change the way they look. So they'll change a jacket, they'll change a hat, etc., etc. But I think Le Carre said this as well, and I've heard it said by people actually in the job, is that, and it is true because I've done it, is that you're on your feet a lot in surveillance, and you want comfortable shoes. For instance, if they're female officers, they're not going to follow you around all day in high heels. Nobody can do that, especially when you spend a lot of time running. So oddly enough, you do tend to, if you might change your jacket and trousers and so forth, but might well have the same shoes on, and they'll always slip up in some way. Faces, obviously. There's often something about a face you'll remember. But any of those signals, once you've seen them twice and it doesn't make sense, you switch off. Mm-hmm. And you go to your sort of neutral state and just shop or become a tourist or whatever it is you do. Because then you hope they're watching you, because they're going, he's obviously not a spy. Look, he's just bought another postcard. Or
just having a nice day out,
Exactly. And that's what you really want to happen.
Yeah. So you mentioned John Le Carre a couple of times. Do you think that's a the most accurate portrayal of life as a spy, as opposed to people like James Bond and Jason Bourne and things like that? What did Le Carre get right that the Bond films and stuff got wrong?
Well, the pace of a Le Carre book is much slower. They do have moments of action, but a lot of it is very intellectual.
I find it very slow, very slow.
Yeah, exactly. And some of the modern ones do get aspects of it right. So I really like the modern Mission Impossible films with Tom Cruise, because the idea is, and they get this, I suppose, from the TV series, that they have this problem, a building they've got to break into, an individual they've got to get hold of, and they just sit down and think, what can we do? What's the most imaginative way we can do this? That's exactly how a real spy mission works. You have this target, the government sets the targets. They say, we want to know about Iranian weapons, we want to know about Chinese spying, whatever it is. You then get together with your team and you sit down, and from my very first days, what I really liked as a young officer was that you would sit down in operational planning, and the rule was you could say anything you wanted. It didn't matter how stupid the idea was. The idea was to do something that the enemy wasn't expecting and to do something new. And often when you come to a job fresh, that's when you have your best ideas, because you don't know how it's normally done. And that's the bit that films like Mission Impossible get right. The bits that Mission Impossible, James Bond and all the others get wrong is all the action, the fast driving, the shooting. The whole idea as a spy is you're in, you're out, nobody even knows you were there. So if you're having to do J turns in a sports car or, put a silencer on the end of your, Beretta, then something has gone terribly, terribly wrong.
Just a quick one. What's your favourite spy film? Just what? You have to choose one to watch right now.
Yeah, I've been asked this several times over the years, so I'm ready for this one, Danny. Yeah, the Ipcris File which starred Michael Caine, not the awful remake.
I don't know if I've seen that one. What's it about?
Michael Caine plays a new agent assigned to a team in London, and he finds out about the word Ipcris, which sounds like an odd word, right? They don't know what it means, but British scientists are disappearing, and this word Ipcris has something to do with it. But the thing about it, the reason I like it is that it sums up the atmosphere really well. For instance, his team work out of a spy base, which is in a shop. And at the front of the shop, there's a little old lady with a cigarette hanging out the corner of her mouth. And she is actually front door security, and she has a shotgun under the counter. And the best thing about that film is that so many jobs I've been on have started with just a tiny piece of information, and that's exploded into this huge, complicated job, often taking you across entire continents. It's just amazing how in the world of intelligence that can happen. You know, if there's a secret project, often the piece of news that might leak out might be very tiny. Somebody's turned up somewhere where they aren't, or there's a flight that doesn't make sense. And that then suddenly leads into this whole great big adventure. And that's probably one of the best things about espionage as a profession.
Oh, I definitely have to check out now. That's my weekend sorted.
It's a classic.
And then just while we're still on films then, obviously one of the most famous things particularly in Bond, I suppose, is the gadgets and things like that, and Q branch and all that kind of thing. Does anything like that actually exist?
Yes. Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, Sir Richard Moore, who's the current chief of MI6, C in reality would be M in the Bond films, announced just the other day that not only is there a Q department, but the scientist in charge of the Q department is a woman, and her deputy is also a woman. Yeah. He was very keen to announce that. But yes, the difference between the films and the reality is this, that, as I said, if you're a spy, you want to get in and out without anybody even knowing you were there. And so everything about you should appear to be innocent. If I've got a radio in my shoe and they find it, I'm not talking my way out of it very easily. Suppose, for instance, I have to go and photograph the Iranian secret base we were talking about, right? There are several ways I can do it. I could take a spy camera hidden in a shirt button or something and try and take footage of it. But if that spy camera gets found, I'm a spy, right?
Yeah.
Or I could take something that you can get commercially off Amazon, something that's hidden in your hat or a piece of jewelry or something, and I could take my film of the security arrangements at the front gate of the Iranian spy base like that. That's fine. If you get caught with it, you could try some kind of defense like, I'm a private investigator and one of these scientists is having an affair and I've been hired by the way. You might get away with it. Because it's commercially available, it doesn't immediately scream spy. And most intelligence services, whenever they can, won't build their own spy kit. They'll use commercially available stuff. And that has changed a lot in the past 40 years, trust me. But the best way to do it, and the first way a spy will try and do it, is turn up outside the secret Iranian facility, and trust me, this does happen, with a big camera and take as many photographs as you like. Because if you get caught, you're like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm here on holiday. I just thought, wow, what is this? You got all these soldiers and everything, and I just thought, wow, this is great. And I just took a lot of photographs. I'm really sorry, and that's why I did it with this camera, with this huge telephoto lens that you could easily see from your patrol towers, and you'd be amazed at the number of times you get away with it.
Quite the double bluff.
But the whole point is, spies have to appear to be ordinary people, and gadgets mean you're not. So when gadgets are used, what generally happens is you'll use some form of quartermaster. So you will go in under your cover just as an ordinary person with your ordinary stuff. At some point, you'll have a meeting, perhaps a brush contact with the quartermaster. He will then pass you the laser gun or whatever it is you're going to use. You then use said equipment, and then you give it back. So the amount of time you have that gadget is as little as possible. And you can see this from the Salisbury poisoning, in which Skripal was poisoned with polonium. We've now got footage of the two FSB officers who came in and went around Salisbury supposedly as tourists. What a terrible story that was.
Yeah.
Then they could put the nerve agent on the door handle and the car door handle of his address, and then they went away again. But we now know that there was a third guy, and this often happened. The Russians often work in threes. The third guy was the equipment officer. He brought in the poison. He then gave it to them once they were in Salisbury and they carried it out. They then gave it back to him, and it was his job to dispose of it. So that's the way that gadgets work. Spies hate gadgets, which again is the opposite to what you expect from the James Bond films. Because every spy wants to be invisible. And the moment I have a wristwatch with a laser in or something
Caught
like that,
red-handed.
I'm a spy.
So it's like you said something in your pre-chat we had with you about your use of bags of crisps or thing. How possibly can a bag of crisps be a useful tool for a spy?
Well, the best thing about it is you get to eat crisps. The point I was trying to make about the bag of crisps is that because spies hate gadgets, the best thing is if you can take ordinary items that anybody might be carrying and use them to spy purposes. And again, some of these are tricks that we're not allowed to give away because they work very, very well. But the crisp one, for instance, suppose you want to know if somebody's been in your hotel room while you're out or entered your premises or whatever. If you take a crisp and place it under a rug or under the doormat, you know your crisp, okay? You know its shape. If somebody treads on that rug and they don't notice, which is quite likely, the crisp gets broken. When you come in and lift the rug, you know they've been there. But if you're ever caught with your bag of crisps, you're just an ordinary person. Yeah. And that's the principle. Being a spy is about using your imagination. It's using your imagination to design operations. It's using your imagination to work out how to appeal to that person to spy for you. And it's using your imagination to say, right, this is where I'm going to be working. These are the possible threats I have. What's the kind of stuff I can carry that anybody might carry that I can use to defend myself? And I mean defend myself not only from surveillance, not only from intrusive burglary, but also in terms of physical defense. That's another aspect. Spies, as I say, if you have to fight, if you have to draw a gun, something's gone wrong, but spies do have to consider it. Spies don't carry guns. Because if I carry a gun in 90% of the world, you know there's something odd about me. I'm not just a businessman. I'm not just a tourist, right? So spies have to be taught how to defend themselves using whatever might come to hand. So that's another way in which imagination is important. And you were asking about recruitment earlier and what we look for. One of the aspects is the ability to use your imagination, to look at something slightly differently.
I want to talk a little bit about, obviously I'm from Northern Ireland, and I grew up in Belfast. That's interesting because obviously Belfast is would be MI5 because it's domestic, but you're working with obviously the Irish, who would be a foreign part. Would there then have to be a sort of communication between MI5 and MI6?
Yes.
How would something like that work?
MI6 would rarely get involved in that. There would be, because we would have liaison, 6 might get involved, but you're really talking about MI5 there. And when I said at the beginning that MI5 mainly does UK, MI6 mainly does abroad, there are various reasons why MI5 actually has some presences abroad. In certain parts of the world for political reasons. I don't want to bore you with the history, but way back in 1909 when MI5 and MI6 were both established with one man in each organization. So you see how they've grown over 100 years. MI5 wasn't just the UK, it was the empire. And MI6 was all the rest.
Yes.
So actually MI5 was doing more foreign work than MI6 because the empire, because Canada and parts of everywhere. It's only really since the Second World War that it's become much more that MI6 does the world and MI5 concentrates on the UK. But that would mainly be an MI5 requirement.
Is there a rivalry between the two ever?
Huge
rivalry. So it's competitive.
I met somebody from 5 the other day, and he said, "You're from the other side of the river." I remember there was a newspaper story not so long ago about how people in Vauxhall Cross, which is the MI6 headquarters, used to refer to the people at MI5 and Thames House, the other side, as the Slough mob. That's how they used to refer to them. I mean, the problem is that MI6, you're traveling around the world, running agents under very often dangerous conditions. All the exotic foreign travel, all the exciting targets, they're yours. If you're MI5, if the job goes wrong in MI5, you just get on the bus and go home, don't you?
Yeah.
And in many ways, people, MI6 are spies. MI5 are more often referred to as spooks, which is generally a term for secret police. And the problem that you have with 5 is that you often get to do a lot of the spying part of the security work, but MI5 has no powers of arrest. So when it comes down to all the crunchy parts of going in and arresting your terrorist or whatever it is, they have to pass it to the counterterrorism police because they have the powers of arrest. So with MI5, you often get a lot of the excitement, but you're never there at the kill.
Yes.
Whereas obviously, if you are in downtown Lagos or somewhere like that, it is all on you. If anything goes wrong, you're the only person who can save yourself. So there's a difference between the two kinds of work, and a difference also in the type of people who are brought in. A lot of MI5 work is database analysis. They've got all this and again, this is how the job has changed. They've got all this technical information from people's phones, from their home computers, browsing histories. GCHQ, which does all the technical intelligence, churns this stuff out by the ton every day. And the real problem, as the 9/11 attacks in America showed, is not that there isn't intelligence out there, it's finding it amongst all this traffic that you've got. So a lot of MI5 time work is spent sifting through this and trying to work out who are the people you need to talk to and watch and so on and so forth. Completely different for 6 because you don't get all that bulk of communications data, and it's much more based on people rather than on the technical side. So there's a difference in the quality of officer you're looking for and a difference in the type of work.
You mentioned different countries, kind of spying organizations. Is there then a rivalry between, there must be a rivalry between all the different ones because you're spying on each other, but then also is there one where you look at going, I really respect these guys, these are the top of these are the best? Or do you think that's them? MI6 is the best?
No. I don't think MI6 is the best. I think we've got a lot to learn. But there's a kind of understanding between people from different services. This came up the other day. There was the terror attack in Moscow by the Islamic terrorists in the theater, which sadly killed a lot of Russians. And people were really surprised to hear that the CIA, had got advance warning that ISIS was planning something, but they didn't know what, but they knew it was going to happen in Russia, and that the CIA told the Russians. And a lot of people were saying, well, why would the Americans would be pleased if there was a terrorist attack? No, absolutely not. And I've known cases where CIA have helped the Russians and the Russians have helped the CIA against a particular target because they've got a mutual interest. And the other thing that I think people from different organizations know, I think the reason we don't say mine's better than yours, not even Mike Baker from the CIA, who is the most CIA man you could ever meet, would say this, wouldn't go around crowing my organization is better than yours, is because we all know that like any job, any organization, we got some good guys and we got some complete numpties. They're not all top of the line people. So you might have a good day, you might have a bad day. And we've all had incredible successes and we've all dropped the ball at other times. But there is this understanding, I don't know, it's like if you climbed the same mountain or you've been a premiership you've done it a job at a level that other people can only dream of. And so you share that bond, you've run the same risks. And sometimes when you've got a common enemy, that can actually work to both of your advantages.
I suppose we're even playing the game against each other in some ways. Like even if you're playing against the KGB or whoever it was or the FSB now, you're playing against them. You're almost like going like, But
not directly. So for instance, we talked about the Salisbury poisonings and Skripal. Skripal was a Russian agent who defected to the British. So in the minds of the Russians, although this doesn't justify it in any way whatsoever, he's one of theirs, he's betrayed them so they can kill him. What they're not going to do is come over to this country, well, I hope not, come over to this country and kill a British officer. Because they understand, it's a bit like being a soldier, you don't necessarily... Soldier's not a good comparison, actually, because soldiers do fight. But spies don't kill spies is the basic rule. They will kill agents and they will kill defectors or traitors. But in general, you don't have FSB officers killing CIA officers killing Chinese intelligence. It's not that kind of spy war. And again, that's where James Bond and so forth gets it wrong. We're playing for very high stakes, but it's the agents that we're playing for. We're not fighting each other directly. So again, that tends to mean there isn't the same sort of tension between officers. Obviously, if I'm working abroad and the FSB can find out who I am, they will take me away and they will arrest me and they will torture me and try and find what information I can get and so on and so forth. But spies don't go around assassinating each other. That's not how it works because, that would never stop.
But then you mentioned they're defectors, and that's quite a common trope in spy films in terms of, particularly during the Cold War films. Yeah. It's very like people who are playing for both sides are playing, pretending to be a spy, but they're actually working for the Russians. Or how common was that kind of thing happening, or is that more of an invention of these films?
It's less common than you'd think. It gets a lot of publicity because when you've managed to persuade somebody from another intelligence service to work for you, and they eventually defect, as happened in the case of Oleg Gordievsky or any of those famous defectors. You give it a lot of publicity. You want people to know. This is one of these things where you can talk about, we've had a big victory. If you're getting secret intelligence on Iran's nuclear plans, you can't tell anybody. Because if you say, we've got their secret plans, the Iranians know, and they will change what they do. So a lot of triumphs you have, like a lot of your failures, fortunately, never get spoken about. But defectors attract a lot of attention. But in fact, your bread and butter work as a spy is to get the secrets that your government wants. Now, your government wants military, scientific, and economic intelligence, political intelligence as well. Not really bothered who the other side's spies are. Kim Philby went around and said, the following people are all spies. But that isn't necessarily of great use. And that's another misconception about spies, the idea that once you're known as a spy, you can no longer be a spy. It's just not true. I'm kind of an example. But it's in the career of any spy, sooner or later you're going to get exposed. Something will happen, a job will go wrong or whatever. You may only be exposed to a particular country, or the news that you're a British spy or a Russian spy or whatever may go around the world. But those people can still be useful. You can still post them abroad, and though everybody knows that they are the British or the American spy, that's actually quite useful, because if you imagine, as we said, downtown Lagos, if everybody knows that Smithers is the local MI6 guy, and you are somebody working for a terrorist group or for the government or whatever, and you've got some information you want to sell, you go and see Smithers because he is the intelligence guy. And also because the Russians and the Chinese, whoever it might be, they're watching Smithers because they know he is a British spy. What they don't know is who the other spies are, who are doing the secret work. And I certainly remember at one stage being pinned up against the wall by a very heavyweight woman who was very drunk, who said, and the amazing thing is, you see that chap over there, he's the local British spook. And they must think we're idiots, that we don't know that he's a British spook. And of course, she was talking to me and had no idea who I was. So it was kind of good that everybody knew he was local British spook, because a lot of people weren't looking any further than that. So it's another one of those myths that spies must always be secret. Sometimes, you talked about a double bluff earlier. Sometimes it can be a double bluff. Sometimes the fact that you're there in plain sight, as it were, means that they don't know exactly what you're doing. So, it's not a career-ending thing if you get exposed as a spy. There are other ways to still use you.
Obviously, not being pinned by this woman is not the answer to this question, because have you ever been scared for your life is the question I'm going to ask now. In terms of, I know you can't talk in detail about but have you ever been in a situation where you're like, I'm scared here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And not very often, but now and again, because, as I say, although I'm not so worried, I wouldn't in the field be so worried about the physical dangers in terms of being shot. You can still be picked up, arrested, tortured, and that has happened.
Right, yeah.
And then you just hope that the service will come and rescue and get you out. But no officers have died, but thousands, literally thousands of agents have died, just say in the British service alone. Because you think of how many agents Kim Philby betrayed. I think more than 20 were shot after he betrayed one operation in Albania. Those add up over the years. Yeah. So they're the people who have paid the price. And that's in some ways the bit that scares me more, the fact that for the rest of your life, if you have an agent and you say to him, I need you to go into that Iranian nuclear facility and get those photographs of the new piece of equipment, he's going to do it. If he gets caught, it's a blindfold, last cigarette, firing squad, whatever it is, and that's if they don't torture him. You prepared them, you put them at the risk, and if they die or they're imprisoned for 20 years, that's your fault. And that's the bit that, as I say, ends careers. Some people will just go, I can't take it anymore, and go. I remember dealing with somebody who'd had a really bad time. And this wasn't when I was with Six, but it's pertinent because it was a very similar situation when it was with the NIS. Something like that had happened, and it had severely affected their mental health. I have to be very careful what I say. And I ended up speaking, not on my behalf, but for operational reasons, to a priest who said, and he's really summed it up the best way. He said, the problem with you boys, Harry, he said, is you've placed your finger against the fabric of the state and felt it rock. And that's really hard. And the reason that works is because you're dealing with people's life. You're dealing with things that really matter. If you get it wrong, not only might agents die, but if a terrorist attack is successful, that's down to you. If you were working on that job and you missed the clues, these are huge stakes that you're playing for. So although you might not get shot, you bear that weight on your shoulders, and that's a terrible thing.
Did it ever have an impact on your mental health in terms of to that level of guilt and all the pressure that you're under?
Yeah.
It did.
Again, it's not something I want to get into, but yeah, to some extent, you don't need patching up from bullet wounds, but you might need some counselling to patch you up from some of the things that happen. That's the sort of way it can affect you.
Let's go. Let's get you out of MI6 then. Let's talk
thank
about
God.
Let's talk about what else.
I've spent years trying to get out of MI6. I've finally done it.
You said it was after the Night of the Long Knives. So that you said this is when the British are pulling back their spying operations because the USSR has collapsed and there's just less to do.
Yeah.
So what happened next from there? Where did you transition to?
Oh, I'd actually gone before the Night of Long Knives. I went soon after the Berlin Wall collapsed. I was 6 on the M5 as well, have to find something else to do. They decide that they're going to get into criminal work. And they opened a special drug smuggling section in MI6, for instance. But the trouble was, all the expertise is in the police, it's in customs and excise, and so on and so forth. And somebody somewhere came up with this idea. I still don't know who. And they found that customs and excise had something called the investigation division, which investigated arms smuggling and drug smuggling, and had greater powers of search than the police. Most people don't know this, but customs officers can search on suspicion. Rather than getting a warrant, they can just say, I think there might be things there, and enter. It's called the writ of assistance or something. And somebody said, what a great idea. Why don't we take this unit, expand it, and get it to do all this work? So you suddenly found people like me, intelligence officers, MI5 officers, lots of ex-special forces guys, because at about the same time, the special forces need to be smaller. Now the Russian threat's not so great. So you had lots of highly trained SAS guys and SBS guys wandering around, and it's quite hard to leave that behind, as it is for spies, leave that sense of power behind. So they were saying, what can we do with all these highly trained people? These days, they'd go into private intelligence. That's been another big change in 40 years. Private intelligence companies are now more than 50% of the game, believe it or not.
Well, what is private intelligence? Just explain.
Private intelligence is the best example would be, there's been a case in the news recently. 2 former MI6 officers, Christopher Steele and Christopher Burrows, left MI6 and formed their own intelligence company called Orbis Business Intelligence or Business Services. I can't remember the exact name. But Orbis was the company that produced the Trump dossier. I don't know if you remember on what Trump was up to in Russia and the Golden Shower episodes and things like that, et cetera, et cetera. Well, there are lots of these companies, Kroll, Olab, et cetera, et cetera. There's literally dozens of them, mainly staffed by ex-intelligence officers from America, Britain, Israel, sometimes even Russia. Because a lot of people in intelligence have found that, I can actually make money by using my skills in the private sector, working for corporations or whatever. And part of the reason for this is that when I joined MI6, it was completely secret. If the Foreign Secretary was challenged in the House of Commons, he would deny MI6 existed, right? And even the memo pads by the phones had top secret on, because you were part of an organization that didn't exist. In the 1990s, MI5, MI6, they become public. Not only in the sense they have great big buildings that you can see, but the government now will talk about MI5, MI6. They recruit openly. And that's great in many ways. It meant no longer were they recruiting through the tap on the shoulder, which brought, elderly white guys like me into the profession. They could do it all in a different way. It had lots of benefits, but it also had problems in that they were no longer secret. And what seems to have happened is that lots of governments around the world, rather than using their intelligence services for some of the dirtier tricks of the game, have said, they've got all these private intelligence companies. Let's pay them to do it. Because if they get caught, it's one step further removed than the intelligence services.
Right.
So it's become a massive growth industry. People who are former intelligence officers have made huge fortunes from private intelligence. Why use MI6 or the CIA to do a piece of spying if you can go down the road, get a private company to do it, and they will get the same intelligence for you? Because it means the government is one step further removed.
So that's not where you went into. You went into...
No, I went to the NIS and...
explain the NIS, just explain it. Just like...
National Investigation. So it was the Customs and Excise Investigation Division, I think it was called, became the National Investigation Service. And the idea was it would become a UK-wide service. They took all the little local investigation units, put in extra personnel from the army, the intelligence services, etc., etc. And I remember I was supposed to be, because Six wanted to learn how it was done, right? They formed their own drug smuggling part. So Six is curious to know, how should we have a criminal? Because before, you've never had to go to court, right? So you've got to learn how to collect evidence and things like that. So you need to start moving personnel across. And there were lots of officers on secondment either way. And I, for various technical reasons that I can't go into, I was supposed to be secret, which is fine. But this gives you a good idea of what real espionage is like. It's always, you imagine these operations are very well planned, but there's always the things that you don't expect to trip you up. I, by chance, got put on a team in the NIS in which there was an SAS sergeant, former SAS sergeant, who'd worked on a job with me. What are the odds? And MI6 didn't know about him, and the SAS didn't know about me. And he recognized me on my first morning joining the team. And sometime in the middle of that first afternoon, I got turned upside down in the locker room by this huge SAS sergeant who wanted to know what the MI6 was doing investigating. And I had to sort of bring him in on the secret. And then once he knew, it turned out that there were one or two other people who'd heard through the grapevine where I'd come from. And in fact, my very first book, Kilo 17, was about the fact that I was supposedly a secret agent, but everybody knew, so the whole game had to change. And the whole reason for the title of that book is that the investigation teams were all 15 strong. They gave me the number 17 to indicate that I wasn't like everybody else. So that's how secret my secret time there was. But I spent the next decade working on these. It's basically just almost exactly the same work as Six. Undercover infiltration of arms smuggling and drug smuggling gangs. Because the link between terrorism, state espionage and so forth, they're all very closely interlinked anyway. And, I was still handling secret intelligence at the NIS as I had been when I'd previously been working at Six. So it wasn't that much of a change in the end. The only difference was that I got to make the arrest at the end of the day. It was the first time I'd been able to kick down a door, put my hand on somebody's shoulder and say, "You're nicked," which is just amazing. when you're a spy, you go in, you plan the job, and then you leave, and often, the explosion happens or the coup happens or whatever, and you've gone. You were not there. You don't see it.
But just to fill in the picture behind that story you just said there a little bit more, you would go in, so basically your job was you would go in and you'd be infiltrating these gangs, and then you run into the SAS guy who's also undercover.
No. This was in the headquarters. I ran into the SAS guy. The core of NIS work, NIS work, was surveillance. Okay. That's why I've become so experienced in surveillance. There was always more work than the NIS could handle. You got a lot of suspects who smuggle weapons or drugs, and you can pick up lots of mules at ports and airports, right? But they will just hire more and the circle goes on. The people you really want to get are at the top. And you often know who they are. They're often not, because they've got so much damn money. They can't get rid of it all. They've got like gold-plated Land Rovers and God knows what. That's how you know who the successful ones are. So you need to get to them. You need to put them under surveillance, find out what they're doing, who they're talking to, map out their organization, bug them, place hidden microphones, hidden video cameras, work out who they're dealing with abroad. So the surveillance often would carry on abroad. So it's just like intelligence work. And then once you've built up a picture of their organization and you know when the next big delivery is coming in from Colombia or whatever, that's when you hit the organization. Now, a lot of that is surveillance work. And that was the thing that I particularly specialized in. But also there was an undercover element as well that sometimes, not all the time, you could put an officer into that organization. And the way you would do that is a lot of these syndicates are really tight. They often are derived amongst people who've met in prison or brought up in the same city, maybe sometimes even the same housing estate. The guys at the top all know each other. That's how they're able to operate. You can't break into that bond of trust. So I can't come in as Joe Smith, make friends with one of them and be taken. It's not like the movies where Brad Pitt will just turn up, have a tattoo put on his neck and be accepted as a member of the gang, right? Yeah. However, what we tended to find with that kind of operation is that these guys would make more money than they could dream of, but they didn't know what to do with it. So what you could do is I could come along as a Bent City banker who dealt in dirty funds, could come along and have a meeting with them at a nice posh office in London and say, I can deal with your money for you. I get rid of money for other people. And of course, they have a little taster just to see if you're genuine. And then if you're actually making the money or cleaning the money for them, then they trust you. Then you can get into the syndicate that way. So I'm saying that because I'm not giving away any secrets, because the difference with the NIS and intelligence work, all our cases had to go to court. Yeah. So all this stuff had to come out in open court. And there have been TV programs about it and everything. But it just gives you an idea of how undercover operations can work, even against the tightest organization, even if those guys really have good security. And a lot of these syndicates would hire foreign intelligence personnel to run their security. I remember we had encrypted radios and everything, and we were still getting tapped because they had people who were technical experts they'd got from Bulgaria and Russia and China, because they can buy anything they want. But it goes to show how even with the tightest crew, there's always a way in, because there are things they don't have, whether it's technical expertise or financial expertise, that they need, and that's your way in.
Just finding a good cover story to get into a tight-knit group, basically, is the...
And what I also found was that because they don't understand that world, you found that your legend didn't have to be as tight as you might expect. Obviously, you prepare for it very thoroughly, but they don't really know what a city banker's like anyway. So there was a lot more freedom to be yourself, as long as you've got the technical details right. Unfortunately, you have some people who actually do know what they're talking about in the background, handling all that. So,
but then you said it before: spies don't kill spies. That was but obviously criminals, do kill people. Yeah. Does that mean that the work actually for the NIS was actually almost more risky in some ways on the ground?
Yes.
So were you in positions there where you're a bit more? Were we just scared, or more in fear for your life?
For sure. I remember at one stage setting up a roadblock for a suspect who had just picked up a load of heroin, which had been brought in on a lorry. For various technical reasons, we need to pick him up away from the lorry. And he was a convicted murderer. And the information we had from the people inside the organization was that he would be armed. Now, the idea was he would be taken down at a roadblock, and we would have armed police would take him out. The armed police, we get told, as we'd actually closed off an entire dual carriageway. This was like 2:00 in the morning. We get told that the armed police aren't coming because they've been called to another more important job. Lord knows what the more important job was. So we literally, and I remember...
That's not what you want to hear.
We pulled the cars across the road. We basically just made it up as we went along. You imagine these things are highly organised. But we pulled the cars across the road, trying to block it as much as possible. But we had to keep drivers in the cars because we thought he might go round it and we'll get in a car chase situation. And we said, if he stops, our only hope is get to him before he gets out the car and starts shooting. So we're there in the darkness, waiting by the side of the road where he thinks, well, the cars are all lined across the road. And you can see him coming in the distance and so forth. And there's like 5 of us who are going to charge his car. And I'm one of them. And I thought, this is like going over the top in 1914. One of us or all of us could be dead, depending on what weapon he's got in the next... And in that moment, you just think, how the hell did I end up here doing this? Anyway, long story short, he pulled up short of the roadblock. It turned out in his interview afterwards, he thought there'd been a major road accident. And that's why he stopped. He didn't get involved in it. So we charged the car and he got out the car. And I just never run so hard in my life, because you just think he mustn't pull a weapon. He mustn't pull a weapon. And we just piled on top of him. He wasn't armed. He decided at the last moment not to take the weapon with him. But you can imagine that is one of the most scared I've been, because you really thought that might be the last minute. And you might think that, okay, just run a bit slower. Let the other guys get there first, just in case he's pulling out an Uzi or something. But no, because the guys next to you are your brothers. You work with them every day, and you've worked on this case for 6 months. So there's no way you're letting them get there faster than you. So we were all running as fast as we bloody well could. But that's not the sort of thing that would ever happen in MI6.
No.
But on the other hand, you wouldn't run agents in the same way in the NIS. And so you see how the price is different because the work is different.
Because you're almost more on the front line of actually that of the danger.
Absolutely, yeah. Which brings its own satisfactions and its own dangers.
Yeah, the satisfaction is you got to nick the guy.
Exactly.
And then, so why did you leave the NIS? What happened there?
I can't answer that one.
Oh, okay.
Well, can I answer that one? I decided I needed a quieter life.
That's understandable after the last story, I think.
And also just having been in intelligence, I just was thinking of a change of pace. I thought I had a moment of clarity, as they call it in the job, where I was on an OP, an observation point, which was on the 20th floor of a block of flats in South London. And we were keeping watch on a builder's yard where we knew they were building concealments into vehicles for a big drug importation that was coming up. And it was, the OP was actually hidden on top of a trash compactor. It was above this rubbish chute. There was a tiny gap where you could get in, you could crawl in, and then we could set up these cameras with telephoto lenses and so forth. But so as not to alert the people living in the blocks of flats, you had to be completely silent, and you could only go in at night time. So it was like 24-hour shifts. And so we had plastic bottles and cling film for certain bodily functions. And it was, and I just thought in about week 2, I thought, I think I've done this now. I've had the car chases, the fist fights. I've done all that stuff, done all the intelligence. Maybe it's time to do something else. I'm getting a bit old. The kids are growing up, et cetera, et cetera. And so I actually planned to, I thought I might become a lawyer and change career entirely. And that almost worked. But then Spy came up. And it was decided that, to help.
This is the BBC show.
This is the BBC show. It was decided because I was brought in by the tap on the shoulder method. You can't really use that, particularly now the services are quite open. James Bond is not spying. How do you let people know what real spying is about? So the BBC we used, because the idea was, if you have I think they got the idea from America originally, but the idea was if you show them what real spying is like, the people who then apply to MI6 will be people who know what they let themselves in for. You don't want lots of people who turn up thinking, I'll get a sports car and I'll get a Beretta.
Yeah.
Right? Because you train them for 6 months, they find out it's not that and they leave. You want people to come in with their eyes wide open for that work. So at the time, it was thought it would be really useful to have that done. Now, that's only going to work if it's authentic. So you need real spies to run it. But unfortunately, the BBC, in order to make their money, then sold this 7-figure TV series all over the world. And suddenly I become the world's best-known ex-MI6 officer and get invited to do interviews all over the world and appear on TV stations all over the world. And yeah, there we are.
I was going to say, it must be such a strange feeling to be the most famous ex-spy. Like, it's not a profession associated with fame, naturally.
Yeah, that was quite a wrench. Now I'm quite used to it.
Where the world is now, like where, as you said, things go full circle. We're now back to Russia being the enemy again. And what do you think is the future of spying in the next 20, 30 years?
Well, again, as a very old spy, it's been very interesting. I remember when I started, spies were desperately trying to get a handful of top secret documents. I remember times, no, I mustn't say that. So I was just about to cross one of my red lines. But I do remember times when I have worked very hard to get a very tiny bit of information, right? Now, the problem is, thanks to electronic communication, there's too much. If you take Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning, Chelsea Manning was able to walk out of the office where she worked with more than 750,000 secret documents on a USB stick. I remember being on a 3-month operation to get hold of a 20-page document. You see the difference. The trouble is, you get all this information, you get everybody's telephone communications, all their internet. How do you find what's important there? How do you sift all that? Well, of course, AI and so forth is coming in and changing the game. So it's constantly evolving. But there will always be a need for that human element in the intelligence. You can find what the messages say. You can crack the codes. But are they right? Is it a trick? What's planned tomorrow? Often you can't tell that from the paperwork. So there will always be a need for the right person in the right place to be recruited. And you can only really do that through another human being. So the balance has shifted, and the skills have gone around full circle from brush contacts to electronics, back to brush contacts. But that essential quality that you need in human spies remains the same.
And very interesting. So it's actually becoming more data driven,
Yes.
basically. Is that's very interesting in terms of how it's evolved, isn't it? And like how, but just that point about how it comes back is just so.
And this is what the congressional inquiry into 9/11 showed. It wasn't they didn't have the clues about the attack. It's just they couldn't find the clues about the attack because they had so much intelligence. So that's absolutely been the change. I thought I would never live to see a world in which there was too much secret intelligence on your enemies, but there is.
If you were to go back now, if someone now was in your position when you were at university and they were tapped on the shoulder and said, "Would you like to go into this career?" Would you do it again?
No, I would run a mile. being a spy is like learning a foreign language in some ways. It opens up this whole new vista. You understand things you didn't understand before. You get into the culture, et cetera, et cetera. When you go through the recruitment process and you get accepted into this world, you learn all sorts of things you didn't know before. You see the world in a different way. But that then dominates you. It dominates my life. I made a decision when I was 20, and I'm here talking to you today because that one decision dominated my life and the things I've had to do and the people that I've had to meet and deal with and so on and so forth. And is it all worth it at the end of the day? I don't know. I really don't. There's been a lot of activity. A lot of people have been involved. I don't want to say hurt, but, it's affected a lot of lives. I always, obviously, because I run this TikTok channel, and there are quite a lot of people who say to me, oh, you've been a spy, how do I get to be a spy? So I refer them to the MI6 website or the MI5 website. But I say to them, but think really hard, because it's not what you think it's going to be. And if you get in, you may wish you hadn't. So Rudyard Kipling said it really well. He wrote that book, Kim, which is still one of the best spy books out there. And he wrote something at the beginning of Kim about the type of person who becomes a spy. And he said, it's written in verse, and it's particularly odd, but it says, they're very unusual, and they just feel this need that they've got to do it. They've got to travel to a strange place and find secrets. And he said, of all those people, he said, they're very, very few, and not 10 are of the best. And that sums it up really well, that you've got to have a particular mind for it, and you're going to have to put up with the fact that this is for life. I've done things I won't be able to talk about to anybody for my whole life. Sits in there, and I know it. People, things that have happened, never ever be able to talk about it. And it is a weight, and it will affect you. People imagine that we're all highly trained and really, really good, but actually, like all organizations, there's some really good spies and there are some really good bad spies. And I think I've only ever met a handful who I could say are really, really good.
Harry, this has been unbelievably interesting. I could genuinely sit here for another 5 hours and ask you a
We
million.
need a pint.
Yeah, definitely after this. But yeah, it was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for doing it, and I can't wait to read your books and have a little dive even deeper into the world. So yeah, thanks for joining us today. We'll talk to you again soon.
Cheers.